why journalists don't understand that they're part of a propaganda system, because they're like, well, I can write what I want. And then I would say to them, well, you can write what you want because they like what you write. That's the point. And you don't write stuff that actually exposes the system, even though it's sitting there in plain sight.
There's no accountability without truth. So, if you want to know how power really operates in today's world, you can't just look at what journalists are saying. You've got to examine what they're keeping silent about. One big thing is that we're not actually in an era of post-empire. We live in the age of American empire. The US alone accounts for more than a third of the world's total military expenditure. They've got the world's largest navy and air force, and they operate more than 1,000 military installations in foreign countries across the globe. And we never hear a public conversation about what this means, still less about whether it's a good thing or not. So this week I'm joined by Matt Kennard, investigative journalist for Declassified and author of The Racket, a rogue reporter versus the American state. We talk about CIA black sites, the Israel lobby, and whether Keir Starmer might be the most secretive prime minister this country has ever seen. I hope you enjoy the interview. Matt Kennard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me again.
So I guess my first question is, how did you become politicised? Where did you start out growing up, and how did you end up where you are now?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I wasn't always political in the sense of...
coming straight out the womb and being like...
Well, my dad's very political, and he's a political artist. So I did have that growing up, but I was more into the art side of things when I was a kid. And I used to go to the National Gallery and other places every weekend with him. And then I did badly in my A-levels. I got BCD and didn't get into any unis. So then I went through clearing to Leeds on a course I didn't want to do. And then I left and went back and did history. And when I went back to Leeds was 2002. And then that was obviously after 9/11. And then at Leeds Uni, I got really involved in the protests against the war in Iraq. And that's where, so I became hugely politicized, started reading voraciously, and started writing for the Leeds Student newspaper as well.
What were the books that you were reading?
A lot of Chomsky, actually, which is, I know is a cliche, but I'd read actually, in my younger years, I'd read a lot of John Pilger in the New Statesman, and my dad used to have a subscription to the New Statesman. I made him stop after they became funded by BAE Systems and others.
Which is such a weird thing that we just accept.
I know, it's crazy. And also the New Statesman, apart from the fact it's funded by the UK's major arms dealer, it's also just pretty rubbish these days. I won't go into that because that's another story. But it was actually not bad back then. You used to have John Pilger front pages. There were other good writers. They did really critical journalism and investigations and stuff. So I kind of grew up reading that. Kind of not been super into it, but it was in the background. And then when the war in Iraq, or the build-up to the war in Iraq started, I started reading a lot of Chomsky. And funnily enough, when I was at Leeds Uni, and I was writing comment pieces for Leeds Student, and that was kind of exhilarating, actually, because I'd be talking to people, and then I'd write a comment piece for Leeds Student, and it had a circulation of like 20 to 30,000. And I'd see my words being printed in the student paper, and I would be like, wow, like you can actually have an impact. I mean, obviously it wasn't having an impact, it was local and whatever, but... And then, so I emailed Chomsky one day after I'd read a bunch of stuff, and I sort of wasn't expecting a reply. And I still remember I didn't have a computer at that time, but I was sitting in my friend's bedroom on his computer looking at my email, and I just saw Noam Chomsky. He came back and he said, I remember it was something along the lines of, I'm really busy, but I'll try and answer your questions. I'd asked him if he had time to answer some questions. And then that friendship developed from that point on for like us. He's quite ill now, but up till recently we were talking regularly, and he wrote a piece for Declassified a couple of years ago. But he's an amazing individual, not just the intellectual side of things. I remember, so I was writing these articles for Leeds Student, and then I sent them to him in Massachusetts. He was at MIT at the time. Just like, remember, this is a student newspaper, right? So I sent like a couple, maybe a dozen comment pieces. I looked at them recently, they're very bad.
Yeah, you never look at your old work is the rule.
It was really bad and very derivative. And then I got a letter back, handwritten by him, like 3 or 4 pages of notes on my articles. This is a guy he's never heard of, a student at Leeds University. Anyway, so after that, I became super involved in the politics. I looked into the other side of what he looked at, which was the kind of psychology and linguistics and stuff. And then I went to study at UCLA on a year abroad, and that was really eye-opening. In fact, it's interesting in the context of what's happening now, because UCLA back then, you could not say anything about Israel. And I was a columnist on their student newspaper too, called the Daily Bruin. And it was just a complete red line. And I did write a column, and there was massive kickback. And now UCLA is one of the hotbeds of the student protests against the genocide in Gaza.
When you say couldn't write anything, was it that you had an editor saying, don't write this?
Interesting. Yes, that's a good question. I think it was just, I don't think it was that. I think remember this is like 20 years ago now, but I think it was more just like the pushback you got if you wrote anything remotely critical of Israel was just so intense that it put you off.
It's like an electric fence.
Yeah, exactly. And we can go on to what it was like at the Financial Times, but it's also exactly how it worked there. It's a culture that you just kind of become part of. And it's very hard to stay in that system if you don't absorb all the what they're saying. Anyway, so in fact at UCLA, in that one of the columns, I did a story about Alan Dershowitz pressuring the University of California Press, which was published in Norman Finkelstein's book called Beyond Chutzpah. And Alan Dershowitz went nuts and threatened to sue Daily Bruin.
A very litigious individual.
He's insane. Bear in mind, this was an article, again, a small article in a student newspaper on the West Coast. He's at Harvard. He was a professor at Harvard at the time, and he wrote. The letter's still online that he wrote about my piece, but also the background sort of threats of suing obviously weren't. But it was just insane. I was just like, wow. But and then I came back to the UK, and then I guess the big turning point for me in terms of journalism was I got a big story about a professor being a racist. He was called Frank. I don't know if he's still alive, but he was called Frank Ellis. And he believed in the bell curve and believed that white people were cleverer than black people and a lot of other awful stuff. Published that, and that was the first really big story I got. It went national. Got on the front page of the Telegraph and the Guardian and stuff. And then at that point, I moved from thinking, okay, I want to do comment, because I was like, wow, with investigations revealing new information, you cannot just like have an opinion that people can read and give or take. People can't argue with facts. So if you reveal facts that reveal how the system works, that is unarguable and can actually change things in a much more discernible way.
I love that you're saying people can't argue with facts. Like, well, I'm like, what?
Yeah, well, you know what I mean? Like if you look at, like, for example, what WikiLeaks did with the US cables and all that, and Edward Snowden revealing information, like it was very hard for the power centers in our society to kind of defend what that showed, like Edward Snowden's revelations of mass surveillance of the population. And then, so after that, and then I did a master's at Columbia University in New York in journalism, based on the fact I got that story. And then after that, I stayed in New York for a while. I wanted to work at Democracy Now! So I was always on the same sort of side politically, but when I left that master's, I was looking around for jobs, and I realized, and we should talk about this because this is how the system gets you. I was like, well, where can I work if I want to carry on doing investigative work that really takes on power rather than just sort of covering frothy scandals like the NYTimes or the Guardian do? And then I couldn't find anywhere, so I worked for Democracy Now! For a while for free, which was amazing. They're an amazing institution, and I'm a massive fan of Amy Goodman. But I couldn't stay there because I couldn't afford it. So I came back to London, and then this is where the book starts really, is like I saw a traineeship advertised for the Financial Times, and I was like, okay, why not give it a try? I didn't think I'd get it, right? I don't know if anyone's ever got the traineeship with BCD A-levels at the Financial Times, but I got it. So and then I started the Financial Times, and it was an incredible experience because I was a trainee. I had basically full freedom to do what I wanted in terms of what I wanted to cover. In fact, I didn't have full freedom, but I took full freedom because I kind of knew I wasn't going to stay there. So and that's how the book started. Basically, early on being at the Financial Times, I was like, well, I'm never going to get this access again because being at the FT, you can just call up. They sent me to Washington, so I was going into Obama's White House. If I wanted to call up an ambassador, if I went to Haiti, I could call up the ambassador and they'd talk to me. So I was like, I'm never going to get this access. They don't know who I am, so that's lucky as well. So I just wanted to collect as much information from kind of the coal face to be able to use to reveal the truth about how the system works.
I mean, I definitely want to talk about your time at the FT and also the New York Times as well. So you come in, you've got this very political understanding about what it means to be a journalist and what it means to hold power to account. How did that go down with the other people that you worked with?
Actually, it was interesting. I started with a bunch of good journalists, and FT is good, as you'll know. Like, it's of all the papers, it's the most serious, and I left thinking the same thing. But how the system works is it just shaves off your sort of jagged edges politically, but in an insidious way. It's not active. It's not like they're telling you what to write. It's just that you become part of an institutionalized thinking, and if you don't do that, then you're going to bang your head against the wall for the next 20, 30 years, and that's not a nice way to live. So if you want to stay in the system, you have to become part of the system. Luckily, I didn't get into journalism for that kind of status or career, so it wasn't a difficult decision for me to think I don't want to become part of it. But the way for me that it works is that it especially in like a democratic society where with the free press, like we do have freedoms here that are real. Within a newspaper, you just slowly stop thinking certain things. So an example being at the FT, if you want to write about Hezbollah, for example, you could write Iranian-backed militant group. But if you write about Saudi Arabia, you don't write US-backed fundamentalist Wahhabi dictatorship. Why not? It's the same thing, right? But and towards the end at the FT, I kind of started putting in those prefixes, and they were actually taken out. So it was quite interesting to see literally how the control works. But actually, no one is thinking, I'm doing the bidding of the US. They're thinking, I've never seen that in the FT. So why would you even think it? You don't even think it.
Did you ever have that conversation with an editor? So when you're trying to say, okay, Saudi Arabia are going to say US back, Wahhabist, fundamentalist, funder of international terrorism. Yeah. What's the conversation like between you and an editor about whether or not to keep that in?
There's not really a conversation. So I'd hand in the copy and then it would be edited and then go in the paper. I didn't really have a say on what was put in or taken out. But the other thing is, I think that there is a freedom that people don't even realize they have, because I started taking the piss, really. And I was allowed to do things that no one would even think to do. Like, for example, there's a house and home. I don't know if you've ever seen the FT's Weekends house and home section. It's just like rich
I've never had much of a cause to go looking at it. I've occasionally read How to Spend It.
Yeah, well, it comes out in the same FT as How to Spend It. House and Home is basically just that rich people showing people around their houses. Journalists around their houses and talking about, I don't know, stuff I don't understand. But there's a section in that called At Home. And that is with one specific rich person. You go to their house and you take photos. And I pitched, why don't we do an Occupy LSX, London Stock Exchange, which was happening at the time. And they were like, yeah, go do it. And they published it. And I went down and there was pictures of this guy in a tent in House and Home. And everyone was sort of saying to me, wow, we've never seen anything like that in the FT. I was like, yeah, well, did you ever ask? And that's the thing. It's just like, no one's telling you. But your vision of the world becomes really, really constrained. And actually, if you break out, there is no real impediment, except I wasn't allowed to stay. And probably that was partly to do with what I was doing. But it's really interesting. It was a really good window into how it operates, because I had read Manufacturing Consent by Chomsky and Herman beforehand, which is like one of the seminal texts on how the propaganda system works. And their argument is that 5 filters work on what can get into papers, from like flack from different groups or advertising or ownership or all these different. And I think that is kind of true. It was a good way to try and conceptualize how it works, because it is a filtering system. There's certain ideas just get filtered out for various different reasons. And I think that's how it works. I think luckily now I am still a journalist, because of the internet and social media. The same with you guys, right? We didn't have the opportunity to do what we do now before. Like,
I really boxed myself in career-wise. I was like, fuck, can't become a chef now.
Yeah. Well, I thought I wasn't going to be a journalist. After I left the FT, I was like, oh, bloody hell, this is not going to work. Like, no one's going to employ me for a start, but also I don't want to do, there's nowhere I can do the journalism I want to do. And then luckily I got a fellowship at the Centre for Investigative Journalism, which was great. But and then we started Declassified. But that route is really is a really unusual one. And I think that's for us as people in alternative media. Like, what we need to do to make sure alternative media sticks and has influence is to create a structure, an infrastructure where people can leave university or leave school or leave whatever they're doing to become a journalist and not have to make sacrifices. They can go and get a mortgage and have kids. Like, at the moment, you can't. Your life has to be messy for a while. And then they're always going to have more power than us as long as that happens, because people want to have a normal life. So we need to create the infrastructure. Funding is the main issue. But Novara have done great stuff. We at Declassified, we've managed to find a way of doing it, and there's plenty of others as well. So it's hopeful.
I mean, you talk about the 5 filters on journalism, and I really want to talk about how that works in what you might call legacy media, establishment media, mainstream media. But just thinking about how it works for alternative or left-wing media outlets, I definitely find myself thinking about what online backlash is going to be, particularly when I'm being critical of what you might term liberal identity politics.
Yes.
And it's difficult because when you don't have, high net worth individuals who are bankrolling you and you're very dependent on the goodwill of your audience, how do you present information or opinions or analysis which is challenging to some of the values of your audience who are also your funders?
Yeah, it's hard. I think that it's not. There's no way around that, really. I mean, for us at Declassified, we are funded by a combination of liberal foundations, essentially, or left foundations, and the public. And I think that's the best way to do it. In my opinion, we don't take money from corporations or states, like I think you guys don't as well. And
to be fair, no states have offered. I'm gonna see how long my integrity lasts until I get that phone call from Xi Jinping.
Yeah. Well, and also the interesting thing with Declassified, I'm sure you guys have found it, like here, is how the system gets independent media, because all the incentives from funders is to cover identity politics stuff. Like, if you don't, and to cover official enemies. One example for that, and I'll probably get in trouble for mentioning them, but Bellingcat, right? Bellingcat is a investigative group which was founded in the UK. I think it's now based in the Netherlands, but it's been completely subsumed into the system. And unless you have some political awareness to push back against that, you end up being like Bellingcat, which is just like, you just relentlessly do stuff about Russian crimes, which are real. I'm not saying they're not real, but we live in the UK and we pay our taxes here. Shouldn't we be more interested or investigate what our own government is doing as well? And I think that has been a real eye-opener for me, in that, because you can see it, how it happens in real time. Like, every incentive is to go and do stuff about, I don't know, LGBT people in Uzbekistan, and we'll give you like £50,000. But if you say we want to do a story about how MI6 has like been involved in some operation in Kenya or something, it's like, no. And again, it's hard to talk about this stuff, because then people say, well, what's wrong about LGBT people in Uzbekistan matter? Of course they do. That's not the point. It's just like, that is what, at the moment, the liberal foundation industry wants you to cover. They don't want you to cover stuff that is systematic, that really exposes the system. They want stuff which is cultural or the froth on the top, so scandals.
I mean, I was talking to someone at the BBC about this. We were having a conversation about impartiality. And I was like, look, the BBC isn't impartial. I understand why you have to brand yourself in that kind of way to get a sort of national buy-in for the license fee. I get that, but you're not impartial. And, they started giving it all this of like, oh, well, if the left and the right are equally angry, we must be doing something right. And I was like, don't think that's true. But I was just like, you're not impartial on whether or not the pursuit of British interests overseas is good or bad, right? You're not impartial on that, because you don't ever think about it being bad. You just go, that's a good thing. And I go, well, of course we don't. We're a British broadcaster. And I was like, well, there you go. You're not fucking impartial, are you? So how do you how did you find an audience that didn't want that kind of, lazy acceptance of whatever Britain does overseas is good? How did you connect with those people?
Well, there's millions of them. There's millions of people that know they're being lied to, but they don't really have fact-based investigative journalism to kind of guide them in the right direction, which is why you see a lot of there's two trends. One is the people don't trust the mainstream media, but they also anyone who's giving factual information that challenges the system or the state is marginalized, so they don't have access to that information. So in that space, you get a wild conspiracy theories, which is what we see. I don't know if you see it all the time, but I have conversations now and people believe some crazy stuff.
People think I'm an MI6 asset. Yeah. And I was like, I've never been an asset to fucking anybody.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I get it from all sides. But I think that it's not just it's not a neutral phenomenon. It's one it's the fact that people are searching for, they know that the people on TV aren't the ones with the real power, but they don't have any explanations of, and so when we provide the information at Declassified, and there's a whole swathe of the state that just no one knows about and is not covered at all in the mainstream media, people are like, wow, I can actually find out if this information is true because we link it all and we say where we got it from, and I can understand how the dynamics really work. And it was really interesting, actually, yourself. You were the first journalist ever asked Rory Stewart about being in Le Circle, right? Which we wrote an article about a couple of years ago. And that is that's just one example, but it's an interesting example that it's got this, effectively it's a secret group. Its existence is barely recognised ever. And it was said by Thatcher's former Conservative minister, Alan Clark, to be funded by the CIA. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he said, and he was a part of it. And they got up to all sorts of things during the Cold War. And he was in that group, the chair of that group, while he was on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And Dan declared it, I think. But no journalist has ever asked him about it. And he's celebrated as this great liberal hero. And the fact is, he came in here, which was good that he did that. And you asked him what every journalist should ask. But that's just one example. And that operates across the board. There's just things are left out. That is how propaganda works in Britain, in the US, in Europe. Things that are not conducive to the state or to the state narrative are left out. They don't. The main way the propaganda is done here is not through lies, although they do that too. The main way they do it is just to leave out everything you need to have like a tolerable understanding of how the world really works. And that's what at Declassified, our job's easy. Like, for example, I'll give you one really good example. Just, was it last year? Yeah, last year, some lord asked a question in Parliament, the parliamentary question system. Some lord, I can't remember who, maybe it was even a Tory lord, but or some lord asked, are you sending depleted uranium shells for Challenger tanks that you're sending to Ukraine, right? And it was answered, yes, we are. And it kind of was on there for a day. No one picked up. Phil Miller, my colleague, who's a great reporter, he saw it, wrote a story on that, like a short story. Like within a day, Putin it became an international story. Putin spoke about it in a press conference, and then he moved tactical nukes to Belarus based on the fact that he was saying depleted uranium shells were being sent by Britain. That story would never have got out if Phil hadn't written it, because no mainstream media would have ever written it. And that's up on the parliamentary website. Anyone has access to that. And that is how it works. And that's why journalists don't understand that they're part of a propaganda system, because they're like, well, I can write what I want. And then I would say to them, well, you can write what you want because they like what you write. That's the point. And you don't write stuff that actually exposes the system, even though it's sitting there in plain sight.
I mean, there's a lack of curiosity amongst very successful journalists, which I find completely mad. And I know what it's like to want to be liked and accepted, because I too have a puppy dog inside me that just wants a pat on the head. Like, I really, really get that. But I was talking to someone who I guess was and is one of the BBC's most venerable journalists, enjoys a very high degree of access amongst the British establishment because, for all intents and purposes, they're a part of it. And they were talking to me about attending a dinner with a former head of MI5, who was the head of MI5 at the time. And I was like, you must have been fascinated by this person because their head is full of secrets. And I would have spent all fucking dinner trying to get into that one way or another. And I'd fail, but I'd want to. I'd be driven mad by the knowledge that they know shit that I don't. And this very venerable BBC journalist said, no, I didn't feel that way at all. They were just a normal person to me. And I thought, what a stunning admission. You are sat next to somebody who, governs a very secretive portion of the British state, and you don't even feel like there's something that you want to know. You don't have that feeling in your body. That's the thing I couldn't get my head around, but it's because they've been conditioned to want the access so badly and to want to be a part of that world so badly that curiosity would be impolite.
Yes, exactly. That's why they don't understand what we do at Declassified, because I totally agree. I've had conversations like that, and it just doesn't enter their head that maybe our job is to find out information that really challenges entrenched power. See, this is the important distinction, because MI5 is entrenched power. It's secret. Journalists celebrate themselves because they do these, every now and then they do scandalous stories, they'll cover the MP's expenses, stuff that's good. Definitely journalism should be done. But that's what you're allowed to do, and that's what's promoted is froth stories, stuff that does not impinge really on people's understanding of the system, and the system is essentially good and essentially promoting good values. And obviously, underneath all of it, it's a system that it does not promote good values. It's a system that promotes war, imperialism, torture. Every bad thing that you can think of is done in secret by the British and the Americans around the world. And if we had a press that revealed it, the system would change. That's why they don't really care that we have a free press. The state, it's like that whole Tony Benn thing. If voting changed anything,
they'd make it illegal.
It's the same with journalism, right? Essentially, the system's allowed to operate off the books, and the media doesn't touch it, and that's fine. It works fine. If you start doing things like revealing what the truth was about what we do around the world, you end up where Julian Assange is, which is in Belmarsh maximum security prison. But we need to change that, and they have a problem because the means of intellectual production or have been moved away from the big businesses or state power by the internet. So there is a way of us diffusing information now that is outside of those power centers, which is really, really good. And I think we're having an impact. So they're going to have to come up with new strategies on how to shut us, you guys, all the rest of us down. But I'm quite hopeful about the fact that the information has been taken away, and also they're exposed. That's why they hate Twitter, mainstream journalists, right? Or they often talk about the fact that people aren't nice to them and stuff. Is because they've had literally for centuries just stood up on a pedestal, and we can't touch them. We all have to respect what this Guardian columnist said this, then it must be true, and he's so clever. No one believes that shit now, because we all know that most of them chat shit, and we know a lot more than they do, and we can and we have an avenue to kind of pick apart their work. So it's great. I think I know Twitter gets a lot of rubbish, but and people hate it, but I think it's revolutionary. We wouldn't exist without Twitter. Declassified. It's the way we get our information out.
Is there a part of you which has more respect for out and out right wing bastards than hand wringing liberals? Because I remember talking to very hardcore right-wing journalist, and I was saying, look, I don't see the moral difference between a Russian-backed death squad and an American-backed death squad. And he just looked me in the eyes, goes, the difference is they're our death squads. And I was like, okay, you're clear-eyed about this. I think it's morally abhorrent, but you're clear-eyed about it. Whereas if I were to talk to someone who works for The Guardian or The Observer, there'd be all of this sort of moral superiority packaging what is a deeply amoral position that just kind of makes me feel a bit sick.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that realists and the people who the sort of the imperialists in the US and UK who say, look, we're doing this for these reasons, that are honest about it, I have much more respect for that, because although I disagree that we should have a system where you can unleash violence on people for your own purposes, at least be honest about it, because as you say, that the whole infrastructure, propaganda system is based on the fact that we do good things around the world. And that is much more toxic.
And that's what you call the racket. It's this sort of delusion.
Well, the racket actually comes from a quote from General Smedley Butler, who was who died the most decorated Marine in U.S. history, and he signed up for the Marines, I think, when he was 16 in the Spanish-American War in 1898, and he fought in various different U.S. wars, and he was like a big guy. He said there was a business plot to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt, and he was. So people should look into that. It's quite interesting. But later on in life, he became disillusioned with the U.S. military and the system that he'd fought for, and he said, and the book opens with the quote that he wrote a book called "The War Is a Racket," and he said, when I was in Honduras or wherever it was, I wasn't there for national security reasons. I was there for Brown Brothers Bank in New York, and he said I was a bigger gangster than Al Capone. He could operate in like 4 districts. I was operating in 4 continents. That's what he said. So that's where. So the book is about how the U.S. imperial system is a mafia system, and it's an empire which runs in the interests of American corporate power, and it's a form of empire which is different to previous ones, and that's what's called an informal empire or open door empire, which is like if you open yourself up to our corporations and investment, then you're fine. If you don't, we'll take you out. And there's various mechanisms you do that. The military, which was what Butler was talking about, but also subversion by the intelligence agencies. And it's a massively important issue for everyone to know about, because this is the most important empire in the history of the world, by far. Paul Kennedy, the academic, who's like the expert on comparative empire studies, he said nothing comes close, nothing to what the US is. Like even the British Empire was kind of run on the cheap. It was its army wasn't even the biggest in Europe. Its navy, which was like its big asset, apparently was the size of the next 2 combined. The US military is just off the charts. They have 800 bases around the world. They have 11 carrier battle groups, which are these huge battle groups which can just go anywhere with aircraft carriers. They have obviously a military presence in 132 of the 190 UN member states. So they're everywhere. And then obviously the CIA on top of that and all the rest, and NSA. And so it's everywhere. And it is the major dynamic governing world affairs. But you can't talk about it. That's my problem with it. So the stuff in the book, which I saw when the FT sent me to Haiti after the earthquake and various other places, you saw a system which was just basically backed by the US or designed by the US to facilitate the extraction of wealth and resources from all over the world, yet we can't use the term US empire. You never ever see American imperialism, US empire, you never see it in the FT or the Telegraph or whatever it is. You will see Chinese imperial ambitions or Russia or Putin's imperial ambitions, but you can't talk about the US empire. So we have a dynamic which is the major governing dynamic for international affairs, which is unmentionable. Amazing.
I mean, one of the things that a friend of mine said to me the other day is that if an alien came down to Earth and had to describe back to the Galactic Council, like, how is Earth run? They'd say, okay, well, there are 2 continental superpowers. One makes all the stuff and it's called China, and the other one just has loads of fucking bombs and could kill basically every other country on the planet. Yeah. And those are the 2 governing forces in the world. And it seems that if you were to state that boldly in a journalistic context, you'd be called a conspiracy theorist.
Yes, of course. But you wouldn't be able to say it. So the mainstream, no one says it. Basically, it's impossible to talk about in that sense. And I think that and the conspiracy theorist epithet is a really powerful one for guiding the narrative, because I get called a conspiracy theorist all the time. Although at Declassified and previously, we go out of our way to reference everything because we know we're liable to get attacked like that, and we've never published a correction. But what that does is it stops people wanting to talk about entrenched power or secret power or the deep state, agencies which are completely secret. And that's what they want. They want people to be scared of talking about it. They want people to they want a deterrent for people to stop talking about it. And there's a whole area of the state and our politics everywhere, which is sometimes called parapolitics, which is these secret agencies. And they have huge amounts of power, and we know they do. And we need to talk about it. And that's how the US empire runs effectively. It runs so many of its operations are run through covert forces, whether it be military and special forces, JSOC, or the CIA. And the book's goes through the history of some of the places where they've used these secret agencies just to overthrow governments, to destroy liberation leaders. I
mean, the scale of detention and torture during the War on Terror, and everyone obviously knows about Guantanamo Bay, but that wasn't the worst of it.
No.
The worst of it happened at CIA black sites on overseas territories.
Yeah, and I was talking recently to John Kiriakou, who was in the CIA until 2004. He served from 1990 to 2004, and he blew the whistle on CIA torture. Went to prison. He talks about. I was talking to him about the Assange case actually, but we were talking about the power of the CIA in Washington, and he was just like, they run the whole show. There is no separation of powers in terms of the agencies of state. The CIA has its fingers in everything, and it's massively overblown. And some people say that the last president who was not in the hands of the intelligence agencies in the US was JFK. That's what Oliver Stone says. And I mean, I'm not saying I agree with that. I don't know. I don't know enough to say that's true, but JFK did say he wanted to scatter the CIA into 1,000 little pieces. So he made himself unpopular at the CIA. But
are you sort of implying that you think that he might have gotten bumped off by?
No, do you know what? I haven't really ever looked into the JFK stuff, but I know, and it could be like the right-wing Cubans as well, because the Bay of Pigs invasion was in 1961, and that was US organized, CIA organized exiles that landed at the Bay of Pigs. I've actually been sunbathing on the Bay of Pigs. It's quite fun. It's a beach, and he. It's
not just where David Cameron goes on holiday.
yeah, he loves it. And then 2 years later, he gets bumped off, and the whole thing was that the Cubans were really, really angry, and the sort of intelligence agencies were angry at JFK because JFK would not give them air cover. They said, we could have won if you'd given us air cover. He didn't. Anyway, that's one theory. So I'm not saying it was the CIA, but my point was that was the last time you heard a president speaking like that about the CIA. You're not going to get Joe Biden say, I want to scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. It wouldn't have got Obama. You won't get Trump's. In fact, Trump's probably the most likely person to say that, funnily enough. So the book goes it goes by country really. So it starts in Haiti, which I think is maybe like the emblematic example of US empire and how it's destroyed countless countries, because Haiti, obviously after the Haitian Revolution, which was won in 1804, and then became the first free black republic in the New World, and then was basically just destroyed by the imperial powers for having the gumption to do that, and the French initially, but then the US took over the imperial role, and and when I went to Haiti, it was a year after the earthquake, and I went with the FT, and it was insane. It was like, I've never seen anything like it. I don't think I ever will. It was apocalypse. Like that was an earthquake which killed 300,000 people, I think, in one go.
Which is unimaginable.
Unimaginable. And this is a small country. And plus, like when I arrived in Port-au-Prince, the capital, like it was literally unreal. I couldn't imagine. I was just thinking, what if this happened in London? Because the presidential palace had collapsed. There were no buildings. Everyone was in tents. And I went to Golf, which was the one that Sean Penn set up, and it was good work that he did, but the conditions were just unreal. But the world looks different if you're an FT journalist. So I was taken around in an air-conditioned 4x4 to different projects being financed by the IFC, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, or USAID, which is the main US aid agencies. And they were like, this is going to be the future of Haiti. This is a new private power energy company. Come and talk to their CEO in an air-conditioned office behind these imposing metal gates. And I did that. And then I went up to the north and saw a new industrial park that was being built by USAID. And you go into the meetings, like I mentioned, and it all seems great. They're like, we are employing 500 people here in a country that has no jobs. So and then you stay in a 5-star hotel. So everything seems great. You're like, okay, well, this is the way to rebuild Haiti. But the truth is, and in fact, the book's quite interesting. I think I kind of think about the book is like, I gathered all the evidence on the ground with the FT, and then I went back and cross-referenced it with the US cables in the WikiLeaks releases, because Haiti, so I read basically every cable that went from Port-au-Prince to Haiti, to Washington from like 2004 to 2015. And I found out that industrial park that I went to that was being celebrated was actually built on people's land that they were displaced to kick it off. And the company that ran it had busted the union. And the union had been initially, the guy actually said this to me, it was troublesome. So they got rid of it. And that's the two worlds, there's two realities. And the way the system works for corporate journalists or establishment journalists is you are given one reality, and you're you have to be very, very strong-willed to look outside that, because you're also told it's all these wonderful things. So why would you look elsewhere? Like when I went to South Africa, it's also in the book, they sent me to South Africa to cover something called the Mining Indaba, which is the biggest mining event in the world. And it was in Johannesburg. And you go there and it's wonderful. Like you go into a meeting and everyone's talking about all the wonderful things the mining companies are doing.
And then you end up with something like the Marikana massacre, exactly. And journalists are going, well, how could this have happened?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't make sense to them. And then you get ministers coming. The ANC minister came in and was like, when I was there, and said, don't worry, we're not going to nationalise the mines, which was one of the ANC's, it was in their Freedom Charter, which was a really important promise, which the ANC, one of the many things that the ANC has reneged on. But and everyone's clapping, and then everyone they bring up all these slides of all the schools that they built. But anyway, that there is a whole reality that's generated, a whole propaganda system that is fed into journalists. And unless you're strong-willed enough to start picking away at it or look underneath it, which nearly no one is, because you'll be out the door, then you have a nice life and you can prosper.
I want to go back to the CIA for just a second. Let's say I am a bright and ambitious university graduate and I really decide that I want to work for the CIA. How does that happen? What are the kinds of selection processes that go into someone being selected for that kind of a job? And what kind of person do they get morphed into as they proceed through the system?
Well, it's hard to know because obviously I don't know anyone personally. I know John Kiriakou a bit, but I have read Edward Snowden's autobiography. I don't know if you've read that, and it's quite interesting with him. He was actually he didn't do well in school, I think, but then got really good at computers, and then was basically scouted by the NSA and started working for them. So I think in the US it's not like here. It's not the tap on the shoulder at Oxford. I think it's more formalized, and in fact, interestingly enough, in the US is much more open society than us in terms of its intelligence agencies. Although you can't get much from the CIA, it is open to the Freedom of Information Act. So you can send a Freedom of Information Act to the CIA and the NSA. I've done it. I didn't get anything back.
Yeah, they might put it in the shredder, but you can send it.
But it's in theory you can. Here you can't. MI5 and MI6 is completely secret. The Special Forces the same. You can't. You can FOIA the Special Forces in the US. So it works in different ways. I think the CIA is so big now, it has to be more formalized. Like millions of people have security clearance in the US, which is a problem for them as well, because you could get many more. Well, they get many more whistleblowers than we get here.
That's how you end up with a Chelsea Manning. That's how you end up with a...
Exactly. And what Snowden did was incredible and will be seen by history.
Does it perturb you that in the years since the Snowden leaks that we've become a lot more casual or passive or apathetic about surveillance?
Yes, I think, but it's like that with everything though. I don't want that to happen with Gaza as well. I worry about this with Gaza because at the time of the Snowden leaks, and it was also the WikiLeaks releases in 2010, the WikiLeaks releases presaged the Snowden releases, but were incredible. You had it on the front page of The Guardian and New York Times. Really, stories that really explain the nuts and bolts of how the system works and completely blew open the propaganda system that we've been talking about. And then Snowden in 2013 showed mass surveillance of all of us by our own intelligence agencies illegally, according to the European Court of Human Rights. So, and then it goes back. There's a flurry of activity, and then everyone just goes back to how they were before. And that it does depress me. But I don't know if there's a way around that, because you have to have we don't control the discourse. So the discourse is controlled by powerful interests, which and they can work very easily to kill those issues once they've come out. But I worry about that with Gaza, because I don't know, with previous massacres in Gaza in 2008, 9, 2014, 21, I've always been like, okay, well, this is going to change the game now. Everyone's seen. And then a little while later, everyone's fine with going to play music in Israel or whatever it is. But I do think it's a bit different with the Gaza genocide now. I think that it's maybe the biggest event that's happened in terms of politically in our lives.
Well, let's talk about the Israel lobby, because one of the things I'm really curious about is the combination of factors that go into creating an incentive structure for politicians. And in your view, how much of it is ideological alignment? So you don't like Muslims, we don't like Muslims, we've got some shared interests here. How much of it is geopolitical alignment? So you need a Western outpost in the Middle East. Yeah. How much of it is cold hard cash? Like, we will fund your campaign or we'll fund your rivals. And how much of it is a kind of political blackmail? Like, you will be smeared as an anti-Semite, a terrorist sympathizer, so on and so forth. So yeah, how do the incentives work here in the UK? And is it different from how it works in the US?
In the UK, I guess it works similarly in both places, but it's a combination of all the stuff you mentioned, I think. My belief now is that the Israel lobby is the overriding factor, i.e. this, and it's not just funding of politicians, obviously that happens, but it's also just bodies which are set up and have links to the Israeli state that are set up to destroy anyone who might step on the toes of the Israeli government. And you saw that in a big way with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Jeremy Corbyn wasn't brought down by the Israel lobby by itself at all. It was a confluence of different interests: British establishment, Israel lobby, arms industry, like every element of the British
billionaire-owned press.
Exactly. Everyone had an interest to bring him down. But they were a part of it. But they're hugely powerful. And I think part of it is that it's got massively out of control because people are scared to talk about it, because there is this, people think it's anti-Semitic or it's part of a trope, because shadowy Jewish power, when it's not. It's not about Jewish power, it's about Israeli power. And every country has a lobby of differing powers. Like in this country, the Gulf states have hugely powerful lobbies, like UAE, Saudi, Oman even. But the Israeli one, and actually the work I've done at Declassified, I think the most powerful country in this country that interferes in our country is America. But and then Israel's probably second. But in terms of, to go to your question, I think that my take now is that the Israel lobby is the main reason why we have such loyal support for Israel across the board. Because I think back in the day, or when Israel was created, or even in the Balfour Declaration was 1917, and there was a famous quote from the governor of Jerusalem when it was under British Mandate period. Someone, this is before Israel was created, but someone said to him, why does Britain support Zionism? And he said, well, we want to have a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. So their fear was that independent nationalism in the Middle East might kick out the imperial forces like Britain and France, and that having a little Jewish Ulster would be able to basically keep the Arab world backward and keep it reactionary and keep it open to imperial control. And I think
they were fucking right.
And they were right. And it did, and it served that function. You know, like they invaded Egypt in 1956 when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. That was a British and a French interest, or British interest primarily. But Israel invaded Sinai. And so they became, and then in the 6 Day War, they defeated Nasser again. And Nasser was the big the British and the French hated Nasser because he was independent and wanted to create an Arab nation and stuff. So Israel was doing its job then. And I think it's changed now. I think that I don't know how much how good Israel is for the US and the UK now, because especially with the latest Gaza genocide, like it's turned the whole of the Arab world against them. And in fact, US ambassadors it was leaked that they were saying that they were sending cables back to Washington telling Biden that you've turned the Arab world against us for generations.
No, it's tanked the Abraham Accords.
It's a disaster for them PR wise. It's also like they've had to smash the system. Just yesterday, Congress passed or House of Representatives passed to approve sanctions on the ICC. So even these imperial institutions, which I think the ICC up to now has been, they're having to smash it all to pieces just for this little country that is 9 million people. It's the same population as London, has a GDP smaller than Sweden, and literally the world's most powerful empire is literally smashing the whole system it created after the Second World War just to keep it sweet. So I think that that's not explained by realpolitik or geopolitics. I think that's explained by the fact that the political system in the US, and it's the same here, has been captured by Israel. And that is mainly done through financing politicians through AIPAC in the US, but also Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel here. And it's also done, as I say, through, and as you mentioned, through smearing people who speak out against Israel as anti-Semites and stuff. And it works. It works. Like the smear stuff works. As I mentioned, Corbyn, he's not even allowed to stand as a Labour MP. It's kind of amazing. And this is a guy that's like been probably the leader of the anti-racist movement in Britain in terms of parliamentary politics for his whole life. And they've managed to present him as an anti-Semite. And that's purely because he has a history of supporting the Palestinian cause.
I mean, just going back to what you describe as America smashing, imperial institutions to bits in order to protect Israel, and saying, well, this shows that Israel's captured American politics. Is there also perhaps a realpolitik explanation that involves Iran, which is if you look at Iran as America's biggest regional threat and its need to shore up the Middle East, well, you've got to bring the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on side, and obviously you need Israel for that. So the sacrifice for that is
but why do you need Israel?
This is my problem.
This is the most powerful country in the world. They have bases all over the Middle East. They have bases in Saudi, Oman. They got the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. They own that whole region of the world. Sisi in Egypt is basically a US client. They don't need a little aircraft carrier in Israel, in my opinion. Like it's not like they have. It's not a sea of potentially hostile Arabism now. Like the Arab world, the Gulf dictators are all on their side. So I don't think you need Israel now. I think if you're a State Department planner, you look at the situation and be like, why we need to cut these people loose, but they can't because the elected politicians who are in control of the agencies are so deeply embedded in this system of lobbying and cultivation. And it's interesting here because you can be specific about it. Here, the main way they do it is Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel in terms of, and what they do is they fund trips for new MPs, nearly always new MPs. Like within the first year, you're taken on this trip by Conservative Friends of Israel or Labour Friends of Israel and shown and given the Israeli propaganda tour of Israel, but also the West Bank. And that has an impact, And then and there was an amazing documentary by Al Jazeera called The Lobby, which I would tell everyone to watch because it's one of the best bits of journalism I've seen in recent years. And they went undercover in Labour Friends of Israel, and that the findings are amazing. Like one official of LFI said, we work closely with Shai Massot, who was one of the Israeli diplomats.
I wanted to ask about Shai Massot. So who is he and what did he do? So
he was an Israeli diplomat that was exposed in the Lobby documentary. And he was undercover recorded saying he wanted to take down British MPs, one being Sir Alan Duncan, who was a foreign minister from 2016 to 19. And he also said that he was wanting to create a new youth movement, which was not affiliated to the embassy, but was being done with Labour Friends of Israel. So basically, it was just exposed at the fact that Labour Friends of Israel is a front, and I think it's very legitimate to say that it's a front for the Israeli embassy in London. And he eventually had that story about taking down MPs there was a front page in the Daily Mail, and he eventually was forced to resign and went home to Israel. But none of the...
Because they'll say, oh, but he was a one-off.
Yeah, of course. But actually, it's interesting. So another thing that I'd tell people to look at is Alan Duncan's memoirs called In the Thick of It, I think, which came out a couple of years ago. And Alan Duncan is like, he's not someone I agree with politically. He's part of the Circle. And actually, in his memoirs, he talks about going to the Circle meetings. He's very, very close to the Gulf dictatorships. He's an oil man, but he's good on Palestine. In fact, well, he's not good. He just has he tries to enforce the UK government's official policy, which is a two-state solution. But that's too much for the Israel lobby. And it's fascinating what happened to him. Like in 2016, he was slated by Boris Johnson was then Foreign Secretary and Theresa May was Prime Minister, and he was slated to be the Middle East Minister because he has massive links to the Middle East, as I say, to the Gulf dictatorships and others. And the Conservative Friends of Israel got word of it, and Stuart Polak and Eric Pickles, who are two senior figures, I think they called up either Theresa May or her Chief of Staff and said, you can't do it. You can't make Alan Duncan Middle East Minister. It's not happening. And she did. She listened to them, and he was not allowed to become Middle East Minister. And there's this really funny interactions that he has with Boris Johnson. He tells Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson apparently says, this was in the diaries, the Israelis shouldn't do this. They always do this. They shouldn't do this. And then Alan Duncan's saying to him, well, maybe what we should do is I take the Middle East brief, but we leave Israel-Palestine out of it. And this is, and then you're sort of like, are we a sovereign country now? Where there's an Israel lobby group dictating to the Prime Minister who can be Middle East Minister. In the end, he was not allowed to be Middle East Minister. He was made Minister for Latin America, for the Americas and Europe. And in that role was a major figure in dragging Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy, actually. That's another story. But his diaries are the best window we have into how the Israel lobby in Britain works. And everyone should read them, and they should be more widely known. But again, it's how the media works. Those diaries were covered, but it was all the frothy stories where he said rude words about Eric Pickles or Boris Johnson. None of the actual substantive issues that tell you how our societies run and in whose interests were covered. So I did an article for Declassified on those diaries, and the headline was "The Israelis think they control the Foreign Office, and they do!" And that's one of the lines in his memoirs. You would think in a functioning democracy with a free press, if a former foreign minister is saying that our foreign office is controlled by the Israelis, that's the quote, you might think that might interest some people, but again, has never been mentioned in the mainstream media.
Sounds like a trope to me, so...
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I mean. It's like, we have the evidence. Alan Duncan is not a fringe figure. He's someone who served in the inside and was targeted by the Israel lobby in terms of Conservative Friends of Israel with his appointment, but also Shai Massot, who was recorded saying we want to take him down. And there's a whole, if you scratch the surface, it just unravels, there's a whole infrastructure here. And I think that actually the Gaza genocide is ripping the veil off because people aren't scared to speak about it anymore. And I understand why I'm not here to chastise people. We all have our own concerns about how we want to be presented. So I understand there's a lot of obstacles to speaking about it, but I think they're gone now, or they're kind of gone. I say stuff on Twitter now about this stuff, and I used to get loads and loads of pushback, but now people are open to it and say, okay, well, this is a real thing, and we need to talk about it. But the interesting thing is, all the people that we have in this country that talk about sovereignty, taking back control, Brexit, they never mention Israel. They never mention any of the stuff that I've mentioned. They never mention the United States. And we should talk about that, actually, because as well as the Israel lobby not being talked about, the American lobby is not talked about as well.
Let's talk about the American lobby. What was really striking, at the time we were recording this interview, the night before was the first head-to-head leadership debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. When it got to Gaza, there was nothing dividing them. There was a slight difference in emphasis, but policy for policy, exactly the same. It seems to me that the consensus position on foreign policy in the UK is that we just outsource it to America. How did we end up here?
Firstly, I agree with you. I think that is basically where And in fact, I think you could probably trace it if you had time, that the Starmer, especially Starmer's Labour, like every time the Biden position changed, literally the next day they'd change. It's almost like, oh, we can say it now. What, like, how did we get here? Well, we basically just took a junior role after the Second World War to try and retain our imperial pretensions. And we are still an empire. That's another thing that you're not allowed to say, but we are an empire, but we're an adjunct to the US empire, effectively.
Butler to the world is the Oliver Bullough sort of phrasing.
Yeah, exactly. And we do perform some important imperial functions for them. Like the work we've been doing at Declassified has been about how our base on Cyprus, which Cyprus was made independent of Britain in 1960. Under Archbishop Makarios, but was it made independent? Because we retained 3% of the landmass, which we still have, and there's a massive RAF base there. There's a massive intelligence station called Dekelia. I've been to both those places, and the whole of the arming of Israel is being done via that UK base, and that's been done by the US Air Force. But again, that shows what function we provide. But they control the political system here through groups that are quite specific. Like we talked about the Israel lobby, but the American lobby, they were really worried in the 80s about Michael Foot, who was the only, since the Second World War, it's only Michael Foot and Jeremy Corbyn who have been anti-imperialist, or at least not Atlanticist
and the two
Labour
most
leaders.
Demonised political figures of that time.
And they were freaking, although it was before our time, they were freaking out about Michael Foot in the same way they were freaked out about Jeremy Corbyn. And in fact, the left destroyed him as well by splitting the vote, creating the SDP. But the American embassy at the time was really, really worried about the anti-imperialist Labour Party under Michael Foot. And Michael Foot's manifesto in 1983, which has been called the longest suicide note in history, but it said
it's like the first thing I learned in politics A level. They always make sure to tell you that the left got humiliated and you shouldn't try it again. But
it's quite an amazing document. You should people should look at it. Like one of the things is they said we should leave NATO. As long as the Warsaw Pact was disintegrated as well, and other stuff. And anyway, in 1983, they created a thing called it was US Embassy funded initially, and later on as well, called the British American Project, which is a really, really interesting institution for understanding how Britain works. And what it was about was, it was started by someone at Chatham House and a couple of other figures. But what it was about was trying to cultivate the left away from anti-imperialism. And it still exists today. And it basically worked all through the 80s. In fact, for the story that I did on it for Declassified, Emma Dent-Coad, who's the former MP for Kensington and Chelsea, I interviewed her because she was approached by the British American Project in the 80s. And she said, I thought it was very strange. I was just a journalist at the time. And she was approached to go to one of their meetings, and she said it didn't smell right, so she didn't do it. And then she was told that the person who tried to recruit her, who was at the time working for a prominent peace group, was a CIA, working for the CIA. This is what Emma Dent-Coad said. Again, not a fringe figure, not a conspiracy theorist. And you see, and it still exists today, and a lot of the people that are associated with the British American Project were the main critics of Jeremy Corbyn, so Peter Mandelson, people like that. So they control the British politics through groups like that, but they also do it through, they have an occupation of our country. I say occupation because we've never voted on it. We have over 12,000 troops permanently based in the UK, spread across 11 so-called RAF sites. They're called RAF sites, but they're not RAF sites. They're leased to the Americans and operate as American Air Force bases, most of them. The two most important ones are near here. They're called Lakenheath and Mildenhall. And we're not allowed to know anything that happens on them. So we can get information about UK activities, military activities on UK sites. We can't get any information about, they say we don't comment on allies' activities. So they operate, and this is, again, not an exaggeration, they operate as black sites for the Americans, our British bases. We can't get any information about what they're doing at RAF at Kriteri. So you got that. Then you've got the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, again, was set up also in 1983 by President Reagan. And that's a very interesting institution itself, because that was also set up because of the scandals with the CIA in the 70s. So they had all these scandals that were getting into the media about trying to assassinate leaders, overthrow governments. There was something called the Church Committee in 1975, which exposed a lot of it. And Reagan's people were just like, right, we need to stop doing things covertly. Let's just put it all out in the open. So the NED was created explicitly as a way to do what the CIA did, but overtly and openly. So the NED, and it still exists. They fund media organizations and all sorts of other sort of civil society groups. And I did.
No wonder we're fucking broke, man. We don't get any of that sweet CIA money.
Well, Open Democracy got funded by it, and I'm a fan of Open Democracy. Don't get me wrong, and I questioned them about it and wrote it in the piece. It's in the book. They were given a grant, I think in 2017, 18 or something. But as well as them, Bellingcat was funded by them. Index on Censorship, which I'll come back to. Article 19. There's various ways to do it. And there's just to go back to Index on Censorship. Index on Censorship is a really, really interesting case because they got like £600,000 from the NED from 2016 to 2021. Their CEO is called Ruth Anderson. She was previously called Ruth Smee. She was a major critic of Jeremy Corbyn, is now an unelected Lord, and apparently a shadow defence minister I saw the other day, so she'll be a minister. She was exposed in the WikiLeaks cables as being a strictly protect US informant for the US Embassy in London. Everyone can go and look at that. It's never been mentioned in the mainstream media. Again, these things are just wiped out. But so they're funded by the NED. The CEO is exposed as a US Embassy informant. Her husband was a senior figure in the British American Project. So you see like that there's a whole web of interests that support and make sure we retain our alliance to the United States. And the first stage of breaking that, which I think we should, anyone who believes in America is the major sort of counter-revolutionary reactionary force in the world today. We don't want to be part of that. So we want to create a sovereign country. The first stage in getting there is to make people aware of it because no one's allowed to talk about it. So we need to get the information out there.
I've got one final question for you. So unless something goes spectacularly sideways, Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister of this country. What's your take on him? Is he a true Atlanticist believer? Is he a useful idiot who'll say anything if it gets him into power? Is he a fully committed establishment operative? How does he relate to this infrastructure of, foreign interests, a closed rank establishment and a system of propaganda that you've described in this interview?
I think he's a nothing, to be totally honest. I don't think he believes anything. He's just interested in power, and he'll do and say whatever he needs to get into power. And in our system, that means basically just signing yourself up to the Israel and American imperial, the American imperial project, but also Israel. And again, you can be specific about it. He's joined and been part of groups that are part of this American infrastructure of control in Britain, like the Trilateral Commission, which was set up by David Rockefeller in the 70s. Again, Rockefeller was linked to the CIA. He joined that while he was Corbyn's shadow Brexit secretary, the Trilateral Commission. And without telling Corbyn, by the way, I asked Corbyn's people, and he said, and they said he didn't tell Corbyn, and Corbyn would have blocked it. He served on the Trilateral Commission alongside Henry Kissinger and two former heads of the CIA, including David Petraeus. So there's that. Then there's a whole his history at the CPS shows that he's willing to do whatever is asked of him on Julian Assange, but also clamping down on people who were 24-hour
courts,
exactly,
and
after
6-month prison sentence for stealing a bottle of Evian.
Exactly, all the riot stuff. Plus John Charles de Menezes. His whole record is he will do whatever's needed for the establishment to retain their power. And then in the case of Julian Assange, it's quite interesting because, again, we're the only people that have done work on this at Declassified, but I asked the CPS for records of his 4 trips to Washington as Director of Public Prosecutions. He was Director of Public Prosecutions from 2008 to 2013. He made 3 trips to Washington while he was in charge of his proposed extradition to Sweden. And the CPS just got back to him and said, can't give you them because we've destroyed everything. We've destroyed everything. That's quite shocking. It's a public body. And it's not a super old material, and it's obviously has historical value, which is the criteria to retain stuff. And then so I sent one back. I said, okay, that's strange. Well, I didn't say that's strange, but I said, okay, can you tell me what you destroyed? And they said, we don't even know what we destroyed. There's a cover up, in my opinion. I don't think it's too far. And that's another thing you see with Starmer. It's not just that he's willing to do the bidding of the establishment, but all through his career, documents go. You don't know, like he's going to be the secret prime minister. His whole history has been kind of erased. And CPS is a public body, so that's where we could get the most information about what he was up to. But he's willing to do what he's told. In the case of Israel, and you mentioned the debates with Gaza, I think that they're actually more pro-Israel than the Conservatives, because you wouldn't get someone like Alan Duncan anywhere near the Labour senior positions now. Like, Alan Duncan wasn't just a backbench MP, he was a minister, and he had just a normal, his whole position was the British government position, but you wouldn't even get someone saying that now. I mean, they're going back to smashing the international system, Labour's also probably destroying itself. Although they'll win a landslide, I think things in this country are going to get very, very interesting soon after, because people have been sold the lie for over a decade that the country's in a mess, but as soon as we get the Tories out, it's all going to be okay. And I think, unfortunately, because we have a mass media that promotes that, a lot of people believe it, but they're going to see very quickly after Starmer is elected that that's not the case, and that the Labour Party is basically doing the same things, on some things even worse. And there's going to be some kind of reaction to that, whether that's popular movements, whether that's the far right benefit or the far left, who knows? But I think it's going to get really interesting. And I'll just finish on this, is that a couple of days ago, I was out with Liam Mohammed, who is a 23-year-old British Palestinian woman in Ilford North. And it was really interesting walking around with her, because you see the people are seething. It's bubbling under the surface. You don't see it in the media, but people are so angry at Labour and their position on Gaza. It's unreal. And they should be. But I don't think that's going to go away. And I think that the global awakening and the awakening here that people are having over Gaza, the fact, okay, well, both the main parties support the genocide in Gaza, that's having a deep, deep impact. And people don't realize they've been lied to by everyone and just stop looking. They think, okay, well, if I've been lied to about Israel, Palestine, maybe I've been lied to about other stuff. And then that's when it all starts unraveling and the discourse unravels. And we, as the left, or as people who are interested in truth and having a real truthful account of how the world works and how Britain works, should be ready to step in and provide some kind of guide for these people, because I think that the whole system's been smashed to pieces, and it's going to be rebuilt, but the question is who rebuilds it.
Matt Kennard, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks a lot.